Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Senior?
Thank you, Teresa.
It's show number 37.
We are moving along.
We are moving along, and we're having a wonderful time. And again, keep hearing more and more comments about people said, "Oh, I was just listening to that show," and I call them. But
Great.
It's really been fun.
Yeah, it is, yeah. Well, we're starting out with the year of 1818, and that, of course, is the year that Bishop de Bourgh came to St. Louis, and it was a year of explosive growth and daunting challenges for the Catholic Church in St. Louis. The bishop announced right away, as soon as he saw his cathedral, which of course was that dilapidated log cabin that was falling apart, right away announced that he wanted to build a proper cathedral. He also announced that he had plans for a Catholic college, which is taking everybody like, oh, really? Surprised. And he also pledged for that college that if the college was built, he would personally donate his private library. 8,000 books. It's probably the largest library in the Mississippi River Valley. 8,000 books.
8,000 books, it's got to be.
Yeah. I mean, remember that Pierre Laclede was a big bookophile, and he was always collecting, but I don't think he had anything near that many. So that's quite extraordinary.
So are they still here?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I'll have to work on the archives and find out. That would be very interesting to find out.
If there are, there has to be some treasures. And if we're looking back at 1818, to have 8,000 books.
It's also the year that the three brothers of the Christian schools who came with de Bourgh went to St. Genevieve and established the Academy of St. Genevieve there. It's also the year that the Vincentians sunk deep roots into the Barrens in Perry County.
Okay.
It's also the year that St. Roosevelt Pien de Chêne arrived in America. It's also the year that Father Nerinx made his secret visits to Europe, recruiting future priests. Mm-hmm. Right? And it's also the year that the Jesuits begin considering an invitation to return to St. Louis. Remember that they'd been expelled many years ago because of the Supreme Council of New Orleans. And then, of course, they had been suppressed for many years. And they're on the East Coast, and de Bourgh was very interested in inviting them to come back to St. Louis. So a lot of things are happening.
That is an enormous year for 1818. That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's got a huge list written down here.
Just like that, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Well, on top of that, things were happening in the little town, village, city itself of St. Louis. The dirt streets, which originally had been set up by Laclede and Choteau, were now going to receive cobblestone paving.
Okay.
That was very important because up until that time, St. Louis can be pretty dry and dusty during the summertime, and you have that. And then you get all these rains, and everything turns to mud.
Right.
And, of course, you've got the animals and, what they do with the streets. And St. Louis had a bad reputation for trying to walk in the streets.
Oh, sure.
So that was going to be a big help. It was the same year that the city fathers founded a police force, and there was going to have a captain and 6 police officers. 2 of the 6 would be assigned at night, and the other 4 during the daytime. It's also the year that the First Baptist congregation was established in St. Louis. So lots of things happening. On March 29th of 1818, exactly at 4 p.m., the cornerstone for the new cathedral was laid by Bishop de Bourgh.
Oh.
And the new cathedral was going to be on the corner of Rue d'Église, which is 2nd Street, which of course is no longer there. It's part of the Arch Grounds, and Market Street. Okay. So if you were to think today, where the old cathedral is today.
Yes.
Okay. And then go northeast. Okay, let's say...
So closer to the water.
Little toward Laclede's Landing, but not much. Let's say we're taking maybe 100 steps. Okay. Then that would be the spot where the cathedral was.
So would it be maybe a little farther than the northern leg of the arch?
Oh, no, not nearly that far.
Not that far even.
No. The Place d'Église.
100 steps, okay.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Okay.
So relatively small area.
Uh-huh.
In fact, if you were to take the old courthouse where it is today, the center of the old courthouse, the rectory, and then walk out, maybe 30 or 40 paces, that was the spot of the cathedral, the log cabin cathedral.
Okay.
So you get sort of a sense of the terrain.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating to go down to the arch and then to walk over to the old cathedral and walk around those grounds and kind of just get a sense of where the vegetable gardens were and where the cemetery was and where the different buildings were, the different cathedrals. So kind of interesting sort of a thing.
I hope they make some little dioramas or something of all of that.
I want to do that someday. I think that would be. I wish they would. Yeah,
things.
but if they don't, I think we should.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. The money for this new cathedral had actually been already subscribed by Bishop Flaget,
Okay.
who had come to St. Louis before Bishop Dubourg even arrived, and had encouraged people to begin looking at building a newer cathedral. And if you remember last time around, we said that the people of St. Louis were very receptive, except for one anonymous fellow, but everybody else very receptive. And sure enough, there were some generous donations. Some $3,000 was given by a Thomas Msgr. And then along with that, another $1,000 by Jeremiah Connor. And then we have a list of all the other donations, so we know how much people had pledged for this new cathedral. And it's a little shocking because the city fathers, these Creoles, were not very generous. Listen to these numbers.
Okay.
Auguste Choteau, co-founder of the city,
Right.
$400.
Wow.
Yeah. His half-brother Pierre,
Uh-huh.
Pierre Choteau, big guy in fur trade, yada, yada, $200. There's a whole series that read like a city map for street names. John Sarpy, $20.
Oh, wow.
Alexander McNair, $100. Bernard Berthold, $100. John Malamphy, the richest man in St. Louis, and someday is going to be very, very generous, but at this point, $100. Thomas Pepin, $100. Theodore Hunt, $100. William Carr, who was later mayor of St. Louis, first mayor of St. Louis, $100. Of which only $50 was actually paid. Oh. The Gratio family, remember that's a big family there. The wealthy merchants who had moved in that first generation, $30.
Wow.
In the end, they felt guilty and paid $50. Anthony Soulard, who made a fortune on real estate. Remember, he was $50. Jean-Baptiste Cabanilles, $20. Manuel Lisa, one of the fur competitors with Choteau's, $150. Bishop Dubourg had an uphill battle trying to build this church for St. Louis. The old church was falling apart, even as the new one was being built. The new one was planned to have a nave that ran 130 feet long and 40 feet wide. It would have been, if it had been completed, would have been a substantial building for that time. The idea was then they were going to build the nave first, and then have 5 archways on both sides, and then they were going to extend out aisles on either side.
I see.
But they ran so short of money, they forgot the aisles. They took the nave itself, and they bricked in the arches, so it becomes a much longer, narrower building than what the Bishop Dubourg had originally wanted. Yeah. And unfortunately, the workmanship was not very good either. And so he no sooner finished and it started falling apart.
Oh,
had to be repaired all the time. In January of 1820, the old church was torn down. The materials were salvaged and sold for $120. And that was added, of course, to the cathedral building fund, but it really wasn't much.
Right.
By now, within 2 years of Bishop Dubourg's arrival, cathedral project was already deep into debt. Already it had cost over $20,000.
Wow.
And they had only raised $12,000.
Okay.
Yeah. And so in desperation, Bishop Dubourg even authorized the sale of some of the land of the Place d'Église, which, with the exception of the church property itself and the cemetery. Okay. The college was erected on the grounds of the old church, And that, of course, is going to be St. Louis College. Eventually, it'll be St. Louis University, right? Another building was also being built in the Barrens, and that was going to be for the seminary for the diocesan seminary. The Vincentians would be training diocesan priests. By the time you get to 1820, Bishop Dubourg is swimming in debt. The recession of 1819 had sucked away what little hard currency was available. Many banks were failing at this time. It was just very difficult. And then, added to that, in February of 1823, the city trustees forbade the burial of anyone within the city limits. Now, cemetery grounds had to be purchased outside of the city limits. But remember, the city limits ended at 7th Street, so that wasn't...
So it wasn't like they had to go for
miles
and miles and miles.
No, not by any means. And eventually they're going to exhume the bodies of the original people who were buried near the Place d'Église, or in the Place d'Église, and they'll be transported to another cemetery. And eventually, I believe, they end up in Calvary, which is much later on, a story much later on. It's also at this time that the old system of the French named streets got a revision. They got Americanized. And so the north-south streets got consecutive numbers. So, for instance, the Rue d'Église becomes 2nd Street. The Rue de Grange, which is on the other side of the Place d'Église, becomes 3rd Street. Right? Rue Per Simple, 1st Street. So on north-south streets, and we keep that, of course, today. And then they came up with the idea of naming the east-west streets after different species of trees. That's why we end up with the olives and walnuts and poplars and all those, The cobblestone paving cost money, and so what they did was the city fathers assessed the property owners, claiming that the property would improve in value because of the streets being improved, and they were right about that. But that's how they ended up paying for that. It's at this time also that the city boundaries were set at 7th Street, which is well beyond the old Palisade and the Fort San Carlos. Now, when you leave St. Louis and go to other townships in the area, there's a lot of growth happening there too. St. Charles is growing exponentially. St. Ferdinand, which is popularly called Florissant, is doing the same. And also Carondelet is also growing. And then added to that, there's a township north of St. Louis simply called North St. Louis. Okay. That's founded, it's around where I think the bottle district, what we call the bottle district is today, that big vest bottle thing.
Yes.
Yeah, it would be there. And then beyond that, there's another township that's founded called Bremen. That's around the Hyde Park area. And then another beyond that called Lowell.
Lowell,
Lowell. And then Mayor Carr, after he left office, he then buys property between St. Louis, South St. Louis, and Carondelet, and he establishes a township called St. George.
Oh, okay. Is that still the St. George?
I don't think that's the St. George that we know of today.
Away.
This would have been much further east of that.
Okay.
I don't know the origins of that name either. The wealth and influence in St. Louis at this time flows basically to some of the early Creole families, the names that we've just named off. Sometimes the Americans resented that. You get in conversation, and these guys are the shakers and movers of the city, but you don't understand what they're saying because they're speaking French. And so a lot of the Americans gave them a nickname, but not a French nickname, a Spanish nickname. And they called it the Junto.
The Junto?
Yeah. Like a junta. This is a junto.
Okay.
And key among these were the Choteaus and all the families that intermarried with the Choteaus. They were making tremendous amounts of money off the fur trade. That's the whole idea behind why St. Louis was founded. The vision that Maxent Laclede Compagnie had is certainly playing out. The Osage are making lots of money off of this relationship. The Choteaus are, and so it's a really going prospect. But in this next generation, we get into the 1820s, these same families begin making a lot of money, not so much off of fur trading, but off of land and real estate transactions, because they've also bought up lots of land. They got lots of Spanish land grants, and the United States recognized most of those land grants, and so they had lots of land, and of course the city is expanding. Right? Well, the Creoles were not alone in all of this, too. There are a number of other players that came in that's just really fascinating. One of those is a man by the name of Jacques Morgan. He's really an interesting fellow. He's from the West Indies. His father was of Welsh descent, and his mother was African descent. So he's Welsh and black at the same time, and comes to St. Louis early enough that he impresses the Spanish who are still there, and he was able to get an incredible amount of land from the Spanish. By the time the Spanish left, they had left him with a land grant half the size of the state of Rhode Island.
Wow.
Yeah. This is 500,000 arpents, which is more than 500,000 acres. The federal lawyers right away started sharpening their knives. They wanted to take that away as much as possible, and they did. They cut up his land grants, and he didn't end up as wealthy as he had before, but nonetheless did quite well for himself. Yeah. Clay Morgan is probably more famous for something else, though, and that is a book that he wrote back in this time in the 1820s, 30s. I have a copy of it. It's about what he refers to as the black aristocracy of St. Louis.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it's a short book, and but he names wealthy African Americans in St. Louis and where they lived and what they did for a living and how they made their money. Quite extraordinary. He points out that in many cases they owned apartments and all, and they rented to whites. And he mentions also that blacks in Missouri were not allowed to vote. Free blacks were not allowed to vote. So what they did was they kind of put pressure on their rentees to vote in the direction that they wanted. And so they had a lot of political clout in St. Louis. It's a very fascinating book, and it's available. The Missouri Historical Society has copies of it. So anyway,
that's really interesting.
It really is. It gives a whole new flavor to St. Louis at the time. Others, what they did, instead of being as flamboyant as Clay Morgan was with his claims, also Pierre Choteau is going to get in trouble because of a huge gift that the Osage gave him, and the government's going to take it away from him. But the thing is that if you fly under the radar screen, you can get away with an awful lot, and that's what was happening. What some of these real estate people would do is they would come in and they would buy about 800 acres. Nobody paid attention to 800 acres. Then they turn around and buy another 800, then another 800. Somebody by the name of Rufus Easton, we had a street named Easton Avenue, named after him. He had 15 claims, all of which were slightly under 800 acres. So he ended up with a huge amount of property, but nobody paid attention to it. Another interesting individual involved in this was Julia Soulard. Okay, she's the daughter Gabrielle Sire, and the widow of the engineer, Antoine Soulard. Okay. And then she goes ahead and has a whole tract of land that she had inherited from her husband. She begins then a subdivision in south of St. Louis. Well, we know that, of course, as Soulard. Yeah. Another, that being Sophie Choteau. She had inherited a significant amount of land, too. That's the granddaughter of Pierre Laclede. Okay. And then added to that, you have Joseph Pepin doing a lot of real estate also. He had married into the Choteau clan. All along what is now Broadway, at the time was called Carondelet Street, and westward, all the way to Jefferson. Okay. And then all the way south to Lafayette Street. This is all now being set off in blocks and in lots, so to encourage people to begin moving and then building houses and setting up housing in that area. There's a very fascinating book by a local historian. His name is Eric Sandweiss. And the title of the book is St. Louis, The Evolution of an American Urban Landscape. And it was published in 2001. And what he points out, and he specifically studies South St. Louis. I don't know that there's ever been a study of North St. Louis that would be comparable to this, but he literally does a street by street, block by block, lot by lot, house by house study of this area and how it develops over a period of basically a century. And he says that what happens is that in this next generation, in the 1820s, you have what he calls a new landed political elite. So before it was the junto, which was made up of fur traders and trappers and that, and they made their money off of that. Now the real money is going to be made off of real estate, and they're going to use their clout in order to develop the landscape of the city as a result. Though much of the new landed political elite, and especially among the Creoles or Catholic, the church did not get much out of them. They continue. Now later on, we're going to see that many of them, once they know that they're going to be comfortable, they become very, very generous to the church. Yeah, but at this particular time, not so much so. Indeed, a little bit later on, interesting thing's going to happen when Archbishop Kenrick is here. When he arrives, he's going to see a need to build Catholic churches, and particularly in the Soulard subdivision, because there's a significant number of German population coming in. He ended up making a deal with the new developer in that area. His name is Thomas Allen. He had come in from the east, bought up a lot of land, and now was developing it. And Allen realized that if there was a Catholic church in that area, more German Catholics would move there, therefore his land would do well. So what he did was he offered a whole block to Bishop Kenrick for $5,000 for the entire block, and that's where St. Peter and Paul Parish would be built. And then to sweeten the deal, he required a down payment of only $100.
Wow.
And then the rest of it would be due in installments over a 10-year period.
Oh.
So very nice.
Pretty good, yes.
Extremely generous. Well, the deal proved to be fruitful for everybody. The bishop got his church. The Germans got their parish. And a lot of Germans moved in. And Allen sold his property, walking away with an 800% profit.
Not bad all around, I guess.
That's right, yeah. So next time we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the college that Dubourg is setting up, and we can see in all of this story that St. Louis is a very dynamic city. Lots of things are growing and happening very rapidly. Lots of people moving in, and St. Louis is turning itself from being not a Creole village as it first was, and not a frontier town, but now really becoming a Midwest city. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. So, kind of the birth of St. Louis there a little bit.
Yeah.
Amazing that year of 1818 started out.
Isn't that?
Is really tremendous.
Yeah.
All right. So we close with the blessing.
Okay. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Monsignor.
Certainly.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.